to Jewish Wisdom on JTV, the global Jewish channel. Well, we're shaking things up a little bit today. We've got a panel and we're going to be discussing the question of, is religion a force for good? We're joined by Imtiaz Shams, who runs an organisation called Faith to Faithless, which helps people from religious families leave their religion. Similarly, we've got Rehana Sultan, who runs she's involved with the Ex-Muslim Council, which does similar things to what Imtiaz does. She's a former Muslim. We're joined by Benjamin David, who's an atheist and contributor to the Huffington Post. And we're also joined by Rabbi and philosopher of mathematics, Daniel Rowe. I don't think you're an atheist last time I checked. But there we go. So let's just get started. Let's just jump right into this. Imtiaz, religion, is it a force for good or not?
My view is religion is a man-made thing, which doesn't take away from what it does in society, and that means it's good and bad for me. Like I would say, nationalism can have good aspects and bad aspects. So for me, religion can help people feel connected to something, but at the same time, it can also breed something like tribalism. So for me, it's a complex issue, and there's no right and wrong in terms of whether it is completely bad or completely good.
Right. Okay, Ben?
I think that religion certainly has harmful aspects. That can include things like telling children at a very young age, if they believe in their religion, they will spend an eternity in hell. That includes, for example, smiting people who leave the religion. That includes, for example, another damaging aspect can include siphoning off your values into some other world. That can be very harmful if you no longer believe in that world anymore. You become nihilistic.
And Rehana as well, go to you.
I think that historically it has basically been quite a divisive force, that has created a lot of violence. From my experience, coming from a Muslim background, there is a vast evidence of how religion tends to have quite a bad impact on people's behavior. But I do agree with Imtiaz that yes, you can use religion as a way to encourage yourself to become more compassionate, become more altruistic. But then at the end of the day, to what extent you want to be an ideally compassionate and an altruistic human being depends on whether you can extend that compassion to people outside that religion. Yeah, right. So that just nullifies the importance of having a religion.
Okay, so Rabbi Rose, we've heard that religion is, they said it's not black and white, but there's a level of divisiveness, tribalism, also imposing things on children, big ideas that can really shape the way they see the world from a young age. What's your take on this?
Well, I think the topic religion is probably very, very broad and at the same time perhaps a drop too narrow. There's well over 150 different main religious views in the world, and they subdivide into thousands and tens of thousands potentially, many of which are very, very different to one another, many of which have similarities and subtleties. There's also non-religious ideologies and movements as well. We think, for example, nowadays about violence done in the name of radical Islam, and right now that's probably the single most dangerous ideology on the planet, but through the 20th century, communism was actually probably the most dangerous ideology on the planet, the amount of people who were slaughtered in its name. So it's I think, too broad and too narrow, and therefore I think there's many, many, many shades of grey, and I think we have to isolate and specify certain areas of topic and discussion. Yeah. I also think another underrated discussion is historically the good that a lot of religion has done. I'm not saying there hasn't been harm. I think there's been terrible things done in the name of religion. As a Jewish community, we've been, the victims of a lot of religious persecution for centuries. But at the same time, I think there's a lot of good that certain religions have brought the world compared to certain ancient values that were very, very different. So I think it's a very complex topic.
So how would you, just to then go back to the rest of the panel, how would you break it down? How would you break down religion into more specific subsets?
Well, there's monotheistic and non-monotheistic religion. There's old pagan religion. There's within monotheistic religion, Islam, Christianity, Judaism are very different.
So let's go back to you guys. So this theme that runs through monotheistic faith, the three main Abrahamic faiths, is that there is this sort of claim of having a level of absolute truth and absolute morality. Imtiaz, do you think that's a good thing or a bad thing for society?
I think absolute morality is absolutely a bad thing, and that's to do with faith. Now, if if you're...
One second, isn't that a contradiction? You just said it's absolutely a bad thing. So
right. Because we're talking about absolute morality as a concept, not... because I don't think actually Abrahamic religions necessarily espouse absolute morality. So if you look at traditional Islam, for example, even the tradition of Islam, there were people that are saying that actually there's nothing such as absolute morality, the Mu'tazili, for example. But we don't talk about that so much. But when we talk about absolute morality, then you get into a danger zone, because that, I think... we're talking about objective morality, and you're talking about faith, and you're talking about faith within certain scriptures and traditions. Right. And then it has that sense of conservatism throughout history. Like we're in 2016, we're still talking about what 1,400 years ago we were, the moral battles we were facing 1,400 years ago when we talk about Islam, or even further when we talk about Judaism, right? So that's my problem with absolute morality. It's not that it's necessarily the be-all and end-all of religion, but that as a concept is dangerous to me.
Right, okay. So Rayhana, I assume you'd agree, and also given your experiences, you feel that the concepts of absolute morality can be dangerous and abused?
I believe that the origin of moral behavior does not need to stem from a religious belief or a divine belief that is not based on evidence. And I believe that, at least in this century, it has to be based on having a close community bonding, where in a community where people are coming from different backgrounds of religion, having faith and not having faith. So I don't think that religion has anything to do with morality, at least in this century. So,
okay.
Yes.
So do you think that what role, if religion doesn't have anything to do with morality, what role does it have, full stop?
People can have their private individual right whether to practice religion or not, but that should have no correlation. So religion should not decide, oh, I have to be moral or not. The decision whether something is good or bad should come from the idea that, oh, if I'm doing something bad, it would have a bad impact on my community.
Would you not say that, when you just said that religion has nothing to do with morality, like, I think it does. Whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it does have something. I think it stems.
Well, let's go to...
So the whole thing about whether it's absolute morality, I think there are things which are necessarily harmful, and if you call that harm, if what we consider to be harmful upon human beings is morally bad, then in that case I would say there are things which are absolutely wrong. One thing would be, I think misogyny is absolutely wrong. I think child abuse is absolutely wrong.
And what's your source for that? You're saying I think, isn't that subjective?
So I don't believe that thoughts and ideas and morality is a subjective thing. I don't think it's objective. I think it's intersubjective. I mean, what constitutes morality is a relationship that we have with other human beings.
But isn't it your word against Hitler's, let's say? I mean, you're saying that there's some things that everyone can agree upon, but and that's the source of what makes something objective. But well,
the thing is, again, it depends on what we mean by morality. If we think that morality is essentially a scheme that's constituted by the effects it has on the well-being of humanity, then you can argue that what Hitler did and what the Nazi regime did was incredibly immoral. Why? Because it inflicted a lot of pain and suffering to people.
Okay, but my argument was that they would then disagree. That, the Nazis would
disagree. It depends on how you define morality, and this is the key thing, because you can perhaps interrogate each and every one of us, and perhaps we'll give you different definitions. I'm sure perhaps the two of you may have different definitions, with nuances. And it's really, really important what to mean by morality.
Okay, so let's go to Rabbi Rowe on this, and all these things you mentioned.
I think I think there's two different questions that have arisen here. I think the moral question is a complex, difficult one. You get into the philosophy of ethics and morality. Yeah. It is interesting that a lot of human beings seem to have what is a contradiction. I'm not sure if it's not irreconcilable. I'm not sure if it's irreconcilable, but it's a contradiction. On the one hand, it does seem that if we want morals to be, which it seems intuitively we relate to them as some kind of absolute, we do relate to things in the world we think are wrong, and not wrong in the sense that if I like ice cream and I say it tastes nice and you say it doesn't taste nice, I think you're wrong. That's subjective. It only exists in my brain and your brain. Even if 90% of the world thinks ice cream tastes nice and 10% thinks it's wrong, we're not going to say they're wrong. But with morality, I don't think we relate to the world. If we debate whether a table exists, then I think we think there is a right or wrong answer, because it's not just within our brain.
Depends on whether you get into quantum physics, but yeah.
Okay, I'm saying whether the statement, there is a table in front of me or not, I think we'll allow. I think people do relate to ethics closer to table in the sense that we believe somebody out there can be wrong. It's not a matter of taste. And that I do think is philosophically more difficult to do if we believe there's nothing outside of the human. That doesn't mean a person can't do it. I think people can have a bifurcated view. In a philosophy department, they'll say there's no such thing as right and wrong, and in the real world, they'll say there really is. But I actually do believe that our moral intuition does suggest something higher than ourselves, that might be there's something greater than an individual human, even greater than a society, actually, because you could live in a world where an entire society we believe is wrong morally. I think one of the interesting points, I think, funny, Rihanna, your point, I think, which is a critical question of, to what extent is our ethics something that ideas have introduced, like religions, and to what extent is it something that's a part of our evolutionary heredity and just the instinct to care for other? I actually think it's interesting that both in the animal kingdom, where there's clear cooperation, but there's also brutality to non-members. A chimpanzee clan will typically be brutal to non-members, but very close to its own. That seems to be quite instinctively human, and early human civilizations seem to have generally evolved a set of values that we don't recognize today as common moral principles, whether we're atheists or theists. Amongst them is infanticide. Still goes on in some parts of the world, but even enlightened society like ancient Greece thought infanticide was a good thing if a child was disabled. Aristotle even advocates it, or too many children are born that year. Instead of working hard, kill them.
Slavery as well.
Slavery, Well, slavery before industrialization, it would be hard not to have some form of servitude. But I'm saying values, war was an ideal in most societies. Peace was something, for the weak, and so forth. So I do think that historically, religion played quite a significant role, at least in some parts of the world, in shifting that. I think infanticide really stopped, or gladiatorial combat stops in Rome when Christianity takes over Rome. I think that the stopping glorifying war, at least in a narrative form, starts to become something that religions do successfully introduce at different places in the world. So I think that I think morality has moved forward, and I think a lot of religions have played a positive role in that.
So let's do 1 second. Let's just focus specifically on this point raised now. The question being now, if we're moving in on not just focusing on is religion force for good, but has monotheism made the world a more moral place? Do you want to just touch on that?
I think there are some really good things that monotheism has established, things that we should all be aware of, but whether that outweighs the negatives, I'm obviously no.
Okay, Rihanna?
I think that over time, interfaith communication and the need for secularism has pushed the frontier to extend the need for morality beyond my religious group and everything. So I think so that's my input.
Rabbi, we're talking about the monotheism. You tend to find, at least in the greater faiths, there's this sense of conquer and rule, and we need to spread our truth to everyone else. How has Judaism avoided this?
Well, it's a good question. I think some of it might just be having been in a position of weakness, but a lot of it's ideological. If you look at the Torah, it never had an ambition. It did to at least hold the land of Israel, but even then, other tribes could keep their traditions, just not their immoral practices. But I think it begins with Abraham. I think it actually begins with the pure idea of monotheism, which is if there's one God who created man in the image of God, then every human being on the earth is in the image of God. And if somebody's in the image, you just want to respect them. You forget. It's interesting, the Torah almost never speaks about the afterlife, for example. It wants us to care about this world. It wants us to perfect this world and be a partner with God in caring about this world. And Abraham is a person who is told from God from the beginning of his journey in the biblical text that his obligation is to be a blessing to everybody. And that means even people who don't follow his tradition. And I think that's a very powerful idea. Throughout the book of Genesis, we find people are being chosen, but the key point is that others are not being rejected. I think today often people feel they're chosen, it means everyone else is a reject, or it's me against you. That's instinctive. I think that predates religion. From the days of, archaeology shows from the days of farming began, humans began fighting over land, and then they built city-states and fought over that, and then empires. We need to get to a point where we can see that difference is special, that we love people who are different to ourselves, where we want to be true to our faith. We don't need to let go of it, but part of that obligation is to be a blessing of others, whether they have our faith or not.
And how is that reconciled with the phenomenon that monotheistic faiths have, which is they believe they have a claim to absolute truth?
Well, I think absolute truth can be that God loves everybody. Absolute truth can be to look at a future world that will be better than our own. And absolute truth can believe different nations have different roles to play within civilization. I can believe 100% that God spoke to the Jewish people. I'm a part of a 3,000-year tradition that encountered a truth greater than ourselves at Sinai. God spoke and gave a national mission to the Jewish people, but I don't have to force others to follow it, and others can have a relationship with God We believe that the person doesn't have to be Jewish to have a place in the world to come.
So you think there is a way to do it?
I believe there has to be a way to do it. That just like in a body, every organ has a different role, I believe in a humanity there'll be different roles to play.
But do you think that it can actually be quite harmful because, you know, it's all good and well saying that the Jewish faith predicates a lot of value in this world, but I think by having this world of being where you get absolute truth from, this perfect world of being, this perfect world of values, that all meaning and values are conferred upon, and do you think that can be very damaging because many people, including ourselves, have left religion, and many of us find ourselves feeling very disillusioned because we no longer think that that perfect world of being exists, and then when we try to find values in this world, we haven't been provided the evaluative scheme to find values and meaning in this world because of our religious teachings. We're all told that absolute truth and value only comes as a result of the other world, the perfect world, the paradise world.
Yes, it's interesting that in Jewish faith we do have a life after death belief, but that's not the primary point. The primary point, when we refer to the world to come, we're referring to this world in a perfected state, which means we have a dream of a humanity that becomes one, where everybody loves one another, where everyone can look each other in the eye and say, I need you to be different to me. Where we literally build, the vision of Adam in the Garden of Eden is meant to be the whole of humanity as one that breaks down, and that our dream is to reconstruct humanity, one relationship at a time. So our place of perfection is a place where everybody can aspire towards. Yeah.
Well, Rabbi, it's very interesting a lot of what you're saying, because for me there's a lot of parallels in even very accepted traditional Islamic conversation, but obviously they've ended up in kind of different places, right? And I think some of it comes back to what you said, that it's also about power relations. So with Islam, there was an imperialist force there. It did take over a lot of the world. And so there was the language changed, while with Judaism, perhaps that wasn't the case. And so it's been much more kind of internalized. But, you know, I mean, similarly, there's a concept of towards the, you know, Day of Judgment, there's going to be, we're all going to be one people, you know, we're going to be trying to do things better. And then there's this utopia, you know, for a long time before the end of the world. So the concepts are very similar, and that obviously to do with where the roots of Islam probably are. But I wonder whether you're giving too much emphasis on the ideas, when actually I think Islamic ideas are not that different, but they've ended up in a very different place as now in the 2016 than Judaism. And I wonder whether you're putting too much emphasis on ideas over history. If that kind of
I think that point is a fabulous point, 100% correct. I believe that the human sometimes is more dangerous when they have a beautiful idea than when they don't. Yeah. It's actually a very interesting, again, I'll talk biblically. The book of Genesis, you know, God brings this flood to the world, and he has this line before he does, he says, the thoughts of the heart of man are bad, and after he says, I'm never going to punish man like this again because their heart is bad. Meaning, now that seems to be a contradiction, but the point seems to be the human being has impulses. The human being is, you know, 99 point whatever percent genetically the same as a chimpanzee, and we are, you know, we do have a reptilian brain in there, so we have all these terrible impulses, and we can live with that. We can tolerate. When you put ideas into it, and a person suddenly becomes the raptor trying to implement a beautiful vision, that can be awful. That can be.
But not just an idea per se; it's an infallible idea. Whether it's a political idea or a religious idea, it's an idea that's beyond question.
Like communism, like, you know, you mentioned communism.
But you see, interesting, communism didn't need a theology to make it a dangerous idea.
But
people thought it was perfect.
That's exactly it. The more you believe your idea is perfect, but there's also been forms of communism that were harmless, and forms of religion that are harmless. And I think it goes into this. Do you feel your idea is so important that you can harm another human being to achieve it? Or do you feel every human is an end, and the way you get your ideal is by living up to it and let others learn?
But if harm is subjective, how can you have an objective morality?
Well, I think I believe in objective morality. I believe there's a God who is the source of that morality, in that the act of creation was an act of love, a love for every part of creation, and we have to emulate that.